I opened my closet to hopefully find my suitcase. I shuffled my things around before finally finding it stacked against a wall near the side of the closet. I grabbed it and lightly tossed it on my bed. I picked out some clothes to pack. I only picked out enough, however, to sustain me for a week. I did not want to overpack in case I had to carry these items for a long time. I grabbed a blanket, a pillow, and some other essential items that would be needed. I was determined. I was going to do it. I was finally going to get away today. Grabbing my belongings, I headed out the door, ready to start my new life. I walked to the bus station and bought a ticket for the late bus to Oklahoma. I waited at the bus station for a while before finally deciding to sleep. I woke up to a woman telling me that my bus was here and that I should hurry up if I want to make it before it leaves. I grabbed everything and rushed out of the door. The bus was still waiting there when I went outside. I got on the bus and gave the driver my ticket. He looked like he hated his job and all he wanted to do was leave. I gently chuckled to myself before finding my seat. I turned my head out the window before thinking, this is it. After all the time I've waited, I've finally done it. I've finally gotten away from my family. When I arrived in Oklahoma, I was feeling a sense of dread hanging over me. I have nowhere to stay, I thought to myself. I made my way off of the bus and into the first gas station I could find. Sir, could you help me? I said to the clerk. Sure. What do you need? He seemed annoyed with me already. I wonder what I did to tick him off. I just need directions to the nearest hotel, I replied, apprehensive albeit. Oh, he said. His face held a sinister smirk as he pondered over a thought. His bright blue eyes snapped up to mine. You're new here, aren't you? He asked, still smirking but with a hint of amusement to his voice. Yeah, just got here. Why? He looked at me as if I was an entirely different creature, an unknown force, studying every inch of my being, staring into my eyes as if trying to grasp a hint of understanding as to why I'm here and what happened to me. Oh, no reason. We just don't get a lot of newcomers round here. Still smirking, he gave me a once-over before continuing his sentence. The nearest hotel is a few miles from here, that is, if you take the main roads. I happen to know a shortcut, though, so you are in luck. As much as I did not want to trust this man, I also did not want to have to walk for miles with my stuff. The bus was already gone, so I could not catch a ride with that either. So the options I was stuck with were either walk for miles and probably not get to the hotel until tomorrow, or I can take the shortcut this man gives me and be there by nightfall. I wavered in my head before finally deciding to go with the latter. Okay, how do I get there using the shortcut? He grinned as if he had just made a big accomplishment. A twinge of mischief flashed in and out of his eyes, so quick if I would have blinked, I would have missed it. Is there something wrong, sir? I finally asked after a mental debate in my head. Oh yeah, everything's perfect. Why do you ask? He said hesitantly, and looked as if I had just caught him doing something he shouldn't have been doing. Oh, no reason. I waved him off. He was being nice, so I didn't want to make him mad again. I mostly didn't want him to withhold the information on how to get to the hotel, and I could feel I was walking on thin ice with him. Okay, well, by any chance did you see the forest area before you came in here? He said, pointing out of the window. Across the street lay a dense forest. The majority of the trees there were evergreens. I could not see any other type of tree in the forest, at least from where I was standing. I turned my gaze back to the man. Yes, I saw the forest. Why? Is that where I'm going to have to go? I questioned. He looked amused at my confusion and just nodded in reply to my questions. The smirk held still on his face. I began to wonder if that was just his instinct when talking to someone. You are going to have to go through the forest, he started. There is a clearing just up ahead where you can enter. After you enter the clearing, walk for about half a mile before turning right. Walk for about another half a mile and you will be at your hotel, he finished. I started making my way out the door. I grabbed the door handle and turned to the clerk. Thank you for helping me out. It was greatly appreciated. I waved goodbye before walking out the door. I walked up the road, searching for the clearing the clerk had told me about. Sure enough, half a mile up the road stood a clearing in the trees. I walked into the clearing just as the man had instructed and began my descent. Along the way, I got to see the most beautiful scenery. There were so many evergreen trees, It looked as if they could go on for miles before reaching a city or a small town. Even though they were gorgeous, I could not help but notice that there was no other type of trees. It was just the evergreens. I stopped for a second to take a break. I sat down on a nearby log and got a water bottle out of my backpack. As I was taking my break, I noticed that the forest was eerily quiet. There were no animals making noises. No wind was rustling any leaves. Everything was perfectly still and quiet. I vaguely wondered why before brushing the thought away. I looked around to see if I could spot any animals around me, looking for the slightest sign of life other than the surrounding trees. I found nothing. I decided to get up and continue on my journey. I did not want to be stuck in this forest in dark. I made my way about a half a mile into the forest, just like the man had said, and turned right. Still, I couldn't help but realize that even though I had been walking for quite a way, there was still no sign of any animals, or noise, let alone that. A sudden chill ran up my spine, and at that moment I decided it would be best to start running so that I could get to my hotel faster. I had no thoughts except for one that kept running through my mind. I do not want to be here after dark. I reached the half-mile mark soon after my little break. There was nothing here, though. I looked around for a little bit to see any lights from a shop in the distance, but found nothing. At this point, it was getting dark, and the dread that I had felt when I first stepped off the bus returned. I was lost in the forest. I started to panic, frantically pacing back and forth, trying to remember the way I came from. I looked around, and all I could see were the evergreens, surrounding me, trapping me in the forest to never return. I searched around for a little bit before deciding that I was going to need to set up a place to sleep. I would have to find my way back tomorrow, and that was going to take a lot of energy. I found a tree nearby and set my blanket and pillows down against it. I scavenged the area around the tree and found some wood so I could start a fire. As I lay down on my bed, I couldn't help but think that this was going to happen anyway. That man probably sent me out here knowing I was new to the area as some sort of a revenge plan. For what? I don't know. Those were the last thoughts I had as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up the next morning when the sun had just started to rise. I looked around thinking I would wake up in my room, but found the forest of evergreen instead. I jolted out of my bed and began to put my stuff away so I could find my way out of this forest as quickly as possible. I decided to start by going straight ahead of me. After walking about 3 miles and not seeing anything, I decided to veer left. I kept walking and walking, changing directions every 3 miles all day only to find nothing. The sun started to set and I was about to give up when I saw something glimmer in the distance. I rushed to see what it was and ended up stumbling upon an old greenhouse. It was about 15 feet high. Half of it was glass ceilings, I assume, so the light could shine through on the plants. The other half looked closed off. It had 2 windows in the front and was sectioned off of the actual greenhouse. I stood and looked at it for a while, taking in the sight. It looked abandoned. That wasn't a good sign for me. I decided to look around the perimeter of the greenhouse to find a road leading up to it, or a house that it belonged to, but came up short. It was almost dark outside when I finally decided that I was going to stay here for the night and then continue looking for a town in the morning. I walked up to the clear side where a door was held. I apprehensively put my hand on the doorknob before slowly turning it and pushing it open. I stepped inside of the greenhouse and my eyes immediately met the gaze of a statue. It was of a ghostly-like woman and she was made from all sorts of blue coloring. Most of the coloring had faded though, giving her a white and gray color also. I peered around the statue of the woman and studied the wall behind it. Multiple blue pillars were lining the wall of the greenhouse. Atop each of these pillars lay one mask. It looked like it belonged in a theater of some sort. They were white with simple facial expressions carved in for the eyes and mouth. They all had the same white color, but each of the masks wore a different facial expression. Some were scared, shocked, but most looked terrified. None of them wore happy or calm expressions, though. After studying the wall for a moment longer, I decided to look around to see if I could find a place to stay. It was dark, and I did not want to stay outside again if I didn't have to. I looked towards the place that was sectioned off from the greenhouse and found a wooden door with a brick wall. I made my way over to the door and pushed it open. I stepped inside and found a room complete with a table and a furnace. It looked like the living room of a cozy cottage you would see on TV. I sat my things down in a corner and got out my blanket and pillow. I went outside yet again to find firewood that I could use for the furnace. After I lit the fire, I promptly fell asleep. It was much more comfortable than sleeping in the forest. I must not have gotten much sleep last night because I felt drained the whole day, so sleeping in the comfort of four walls helped me find peaceful rest. I woke up in the middle of the night to a scratching noise on the floor. I sat up from my bed and looked around the room. The dim light of the burning fire lit up the entire room so I could see that nothing was disturbed in this room. I heard the noise once again and realized that it must have been coming from outside in the greenhouse. I went to go investigate and see if someone had come here. If I did find someone I knew, I would beg them to give me a ride to the nearest town. My heart rejoiced with the thought that I would finally be able to be free from the evil clutches of this forest. I opened the door separating me from the greenhouse and peered inside. I didn't see anything, which was a big problem. The statue that once sat in the middle of the garden was no longer there. I walked into the greenhouse wondering why someone would steal a statue like that. It must have weighed a lot, so I don't understand why someone would go through all of that trouble. I made my way to the center of the garden where the statue once was. Again, I heard the scraping sound that had woke me up. Alarmed, I turned around to see what the sound was. To my surprise, I had come face to face with the missing statue. I looked on the ground behind the statue to see if I could find any footprints or signs that someone had been here. All I had found, though, was drag marks from where the statue had come from. They led to the door, where I had been up to the point where the statue was now. I thought nothing of it other than some teenagers pulling a prank. I walked past the statue so that I could go get my stuff and leave. As soon as I had walked past it, though, something grabbed me from behind. I turned around briskly to once again come face to face with the statue, except this time it was holding me in a death-like grip. I struggled to get free from its grasp, still unbelieving as to what was happening to me. I flopped on the ground beside the statue, my eyes still locked on the thing that had just attacked me. Before I knew what I was doing, I was running for the door on the side wall. I got to the door and grasped the handle. All of a sudden, I was grabbed again, except this time I could not turn around to see what it was, although I had a pretty good idea. I struggled once again, but this time the more I struggled, the more its grip tightened around me. All of a sudden, everything went black. I was sucked into an inky abyss, never to return. The next morning, the statue had returned to its former place in the center of the garden. Nothing was disturbed and every trace of me was gone, even my backpack. The only new feature to the dreaded garden was a new mask with a terrified and slightly confused expression upon it. Most of you have heard of a serial killer who collects trophies from their victims. Well, I figured out that that is exactly what the masks were. Reminders of the statue's victims with their last facial expression ever made imprinted upon it. That last mask that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere that night was mine, and I had been the newest victim. It had been a rough few months for Mason with his parents divorcing, and him and his mother moving out of the city and into a house in the middle of nowhere, having to leave all of his friends he had made in the 13 years of his life behind. We can easily assume luck was not on Mason's side, but that was all just the beginning of Mason's misfortune. The crunching of rubber tires meeting with the unkept gravel driveway as Mason's mom pulls up to the house. "Well, we are here," she says as she puts the car in park and turns off the vehicle. For the first time in the entire trip, Mason takes his head off of the window. He looks at the small house that he will be staying at for the foreseeable future. The structure looks like it is still strong, but the paint is peeling. Dirt litters the sides of the house and the yard is overgrown. They each get out of the car and one by one haul their suitcases up to the porch and through the rickety old front door. Mason looks around at the living room that connects to the kitchen, just taking in the views of the new old house. The stench in the place is unique. A very distinctive musty odor wafts throughout the house. Down the hall, Mason entered his new room for the first time. There was already a bed in there and a nightstand. The walls were not painted and just had stained wood finish. The head of his bed rested against the wall that had the only window in the room. He swung his suitcase up and onto the bed and began to unpack all of his clothes and organize them. Time seemed to go by quickly, and the foggy woodlands turned to sunset, and his mother called him out for their first meal in the new house. "Well, how do you like it here?" his mother asked. "It's all right, I suppose. A bit creepy," Mason responded. "Creepy? What is so creepy about it?" the mother replied. "Just that we are alone out here, just us. No neighbors, no friends, no traffic, nothing. Just us," Mason answered. "Well, it is just something you will have to get used to," said his mom. After supper, Mason took a quick shower before heading off to bed. He was exhausted from the long trip and all of the unpacking, but he could not seem to go to sleep. The room, as crazy as it sounds, was just too dark for him, even with the bright light outside that hung above his window. He had grown so used to the light pollution and bustling noise of the city that anything else just felt weird. And so he sat there and stared into the darkness until his mind began to make shapes. He eventually rolled over and looked at his clock. It read 3 a.m. The light outside had started to make a hissing noise, and that mixed with his sleep deprivation was enough to finally get him some sleep. In the morning, he woke up to the sound of bacon and eggs snapping in the skillet. His mom made him a plate as he was walking down the hall. "I am going to need you to do me a favor," she said, handing him the plate. "I need you to go outside after you get done eating and chop some wood for the fire." This was going to be a learning experience for him since he had never had to chop wood before. But reluctantly, when he cleaned his plate, he got dressed and went out to the front where the stump was located, along with the wood maul. After a few attempts, he started to get the hang of it. But by about the third log he was about to split, he had an overwhelming sensation that he was being watched. He looked over into the tree lines and thought he might have seen someone there watching him, but more so judging him. Annoyed at this, he gathered the few logs he had split, and he went back inside to put them in the fireplace. Nothing exciting happened after that. Lots of cleaning and getting things unpacked and turning the house into a home. That night went about the same as the previous night. Mason couldn't seem to sleep. He went through the same motions, staring at shapes in the dark, looking at his clock. The light outside was hissing, but tonight the light also seemed to have a slight flicker, and so Mason became tranced by the flickering light. But in a split second, a dark shadow rushed past his window. This startled Mason. He couldn't convince himself what he just saw wasn't just his eyes messing with him. So after being spooked, he decided it would just be best to roll over, forget about it, and go to sleep. Maybe in the morning he would bring it up to his mom, and she would have some logic for it. So in the morning, Mason woke up and walked down the hall and into the kitchen. He sat down at the bar that divided the kitchen from the living room. "How did you sleep?" his mother asked. Not so good again. But hey, were you outside for any reason last night around 3 a.m.? "I swear I saw some shadow dart past my window," Mason replied. "No, but it wouldn't surprise me if you saw that. Just because we are the only people out here does not mean we are the only living things out here. It was probably just some animal," his mother said, brushing him off. Well, it must have been a big animal then, Mason thought to himself. Mason and his mom then get in the car and drive into town. They pick up a few supplies at the local hardware store. "How are you folks doing?" asked the store clerk as they placed their items onto the counter. "I'm doing pretty good. My son Mason, however, seems to have found a boogeyman," Mason's mom said, mocking him. "Oh, is that so? Did you run into the old Dark Watcher?" the clerk sarcastically asked Mason as he laughed. They pay for their items and return back to their car and drive off. The car ride is silent after that encounter. Mason could not believe that not only did his mom not believe him, but she would belittle him to some stranger in the store. Once home, Mason becomes visually angry, slamming the car door as he gets out. Seeing that her son is upset, she confronted him about it, and Mason had no issues telling her how he felt, after which she gave a half-genuine apology and promised that in the future she would be more open to listening to him. That seemed to be good enough for him, and he let it all go. They then teamed up to start redoing the exterior of the house by cleaning the dirt off the walls and repainting the trim and the post that held the porch up. All the hard work he did almost made him forget about what happened the previous night, and he got ready for bed and laid down. Only it was the same routine. Can't sleep, mind making shapes in the dark, checking the clock, watching the light, and again the figure walks past his window. Only this time he also hears the front door open, then footsteps that get louder and louder as they walk closer and closer down the hall, till they sound like they are right outside the bedroom door when they can no longer be heard. Under the door, the shadows of someone standing at the door can be seen as the nightlight in the hallway shined. Mason is in horror and frozen in place, terrified of what is about to happen. Then he hears soft tapping on the top of his door. Tap, tap, tap. Mason trembles and his breathing becomes heavy. The tapping is replaced by the jingling of the doorknob till it turns all the way over and the latch bolt frees itself, and gently the door is pushed open, and in the doorway stood a massive 8-foot-tall dark silhouette with no facial features. It just stood there in the doorway. Mason finally builds up the courage to speak. Mom. The shadow does not reply, only turns and walks away with the old floorboards creaking to the rhythm of this creature's footsteps. After some time had passed since the last footstep was heard, Mason rushed into his mom's room, pouncing on her. The fear had taken over his body. Even his mouth was too dry to talk. "I saw it. The creature," he said. His mother was not having it, though. "I am sick of this nonsensical game. You have got to get over this. You are too old to be afraid of monsters. Go to bed," she commanded. Mason unwillingly returned back to his bed and did not sleep until the sun was fully up. All night he stayed focused on the door in fear that that thing would return. By the time Mason woke up, it was nighttime again. He had enough time to eat supper before his mom would retire for the night while he would stay up. That night, though, nothing came for him, but he stayed up regardless, just in case. Again falling asleep when the sun had risen and waking up well past the time of the moon. That time, however, the creature did come for him, past the window, through the front door, down the hall, opening the bedroom door. Mason called out, "Mom," hoping it would work like last time. It didn't. The creature steps into his room. Mason can feel the vibration as the dark figure inches closer and closer till it is hovering over Mason's bed, but not looking down at him. Instead, it is just staring straight at the wall as if Mason was not there. It just stood there silently and motionless, till after a few seconds it turned around back down the hall, out the front door, and disappearing. This time Mason didn't even bother to go to his mom. She was clearly not wanting to listen to it, and all she would do is make it worse by not believing him. So he again just stayed up the remainder of the night. The next night after Mason had awoken, he came up with this idea. He decided to place a thick bead of salt across his door and then just wait. So when the time came around, the creature was right on cue. Past the window, through the door, down the hall, opening the bedroom door, and when it went to take a step into the salt, it was stopped. It could not cross the salt. The creature looked down at it, looked back up at Mason, and left the same way it came. This caused Mason to take the biggest sigh of relief, and finally he could get to sleep at a decent time. He wakes up the next morning well rested and relieved, having defeated this dark watcher, which is now a joke to him now that he knows its weakness. Mason came strutting down the hall in one of the best moods he had been in since the move. He fixes a plate and then is ready to start the day. He goes out and chops some more wood, paints some more spots on the house, cuts down some tree saplings in the yard that needed to be taken care of, all with no issues at all from sun up to sundown. He was helping around the house. Him and his mother sat down and had a huge supper. It was a feast fit for a king. He then took a long overdue shower and went to bed, but not forgetting to add new salt to his doorway. Mason climbed into bed, threw the covers over him, and then looked at the clock that now read 10 p.m., and he drifted off to sleep. Later that night, when his mother was about to go to bed herself, she decided she would check on him and make sure he was okay after all the stories he had told her. When she creeped into the bedroom, though, he was sound asleep. She walked over to the window and cracked it open so he wouldn't get too hot in the night, and then kissed him on the forehead before taking herself to bed. The light outside begins to flicker, and the dark watcher climbs through the window to Mason's bedroom, hovering over his bed, and then nothing more than an echo of a scream, and the slamming shut of the window is heard. I remember it like it was yesterday, a late night, early morning in 2014, and it has been the most terrifying experience of my life. See, I'm a pretty avid outdoorsy person. I go hiking, rock climbing, camping, the occasional cave diving, that sort of outdoorsy. While I have come across some pretty scary experiences, like happening upon a mother bear and her cubs who weren't too happy to see me, to crawling into a small cave to get out of the weather and finding a pack of feral dogs eating a fresh kill, all the way down to being lost and stranded for 48 hours in a national state park, with temperatures plummeting and rain turning to ice. All of this, and it pales in comparison to what happened to me that day. A buddy of mine, we'll call him Michael for this story, and I had been planning to set out on a hiking camping trip for months now in a remote area of southern Illinois, not too far from the Shawnee National Forest. This particular day we decided I would be driving, and he would navigate us to where we needed to go. This is important, as it is normally the other way around, being that he is horrible with directions. The long and short of it is, we arrive at an area that is pretty remote. The paved highway became a gravel road, which then turned to mostly dirt about 7 miles back. I should have known then that we were lost, but he assured me that he knew where we were. Finally admitting that we were lost, and he had no idea where we were, we settled on going ahead and finding a place to set up camp and explore this area, seeing that we were actually looking for a location that was remote and likely not contaminated by tourists. After setting up our campsite, we pulled out our GPS and began to check the area out. We'd only walked a couple miles from our tent when I began to notice this forest was a little more different than I had anticipated. To put it in perspective, a storm had recently rolled through the area, and a lot of limbs and larger branches were down, making navigating a little tougher than we had wanted, but we made do. What I had noticed, though, was not branches all over the place, but that many of the trees were missing bark up higher along the trunks, and not like the bark had blown off, but like it had been peeled off cleanly. Now I know there are a ton of reasons that something like this could happen, but it just struck me as odd, as it seemed to be in clusters that this was present, and it was not like it was torn along the entire tree, just in spots about 10 long. Again, nothing to set off alarm bells or anything, just a weird phenomenon of nature. If you have ever been hiking in the woods, you know the sounds: birds chirping, wind blowing, leaves rustling, frogs, crickets, wildlife just living their best lives out there. And if you are in tune with nature, and you have spent some time out in it, you know when things change. I'm talking about when everything goes silent. No animal sounds, no insects singing, nothing. In most instances, because science, this means that a natural predator is in the area and the wildlife is trying to not become its next prey. It is a hell of an adrenal rush, to say the least, when this happens, because you don't know if you are the predator or if it's something that considers you prey. Even then, some things are just different. Walking along no path in particular, we both must have noticed at the same time, but the birds had silenced themselves. Frogs had hushed, and not a cricket could be heard, just the wind, the crunching below our feet, and the sounds of the trees rubbing together above our heads. Mike looked over at me with this furrowed look on his face and whispered about how quiet everything was, and I agreed and noted that the air around us smelled foul, putrid even, and tried not to gag. This is where things changed. Like I said, if you have been in nature enough, you recognize the sounds. You know the sounds of cracking and grinding tree branches. You know what it sounds like when the wind blows a smaller branch into a larger one, making thudding sounds. You know these things. What you may not know is the sound of branches rubbing together, making a creaking sound. That's the best way that I can describe it. After about 30 minutes of us heading deeper into the woods, the creech grew louder, and some quieter more off in the distance. Same tone, but different pitches. See, branches rubbing together don't just change pitch. They don't go from a real dull sound to an almost high-pitched whining sound. They just don't. They aren't capable of that. At this point, I'll be honest, I was getting a bit uncomfortable. And not that uncomfortable feeling like my feet hurt and I need to rest, but that feeling of unease, like something was watching me, or that I didn't belong where I was. The hair on my arms and neck were standing at full attention, the goosebumps that covered my body, and not fear, not dread, but overall terror just filled me from my core. There is no other way to explain it. Like I said earlier, I've mistakenly walked up on a mother bear and her cubs, and that was definitely fearful. But this was utter terror that filled me, and I had no idea why. Looking over at Michael, I noticed he could feel something too. so I suggested we head back to camp and just search around there a bit and get comfortable as nightfall was approaching soon. We made our trek back, and the closer we got to camp, the more the mood lightened and the more comfortable I became. I got to work on starting a small fire while Mike went to search for more logs and branches for it. About 10 minutes later, there was a rustle in the foliage behind me, branches snapping and the sound of something rushing toward me. I grabbed the large branch I was using to stir the fire up and prepared for the worst. That's when Mike burst through the tree line looking white as a ghost and kept glancing behind him. It took a few minutes to calm him down enough to talk to me, but what he told me chilled me. He had gathered half a dozen small branches and came across a clearing we had missed earlier with a small pond in the center. He decided to head down toward it and see if there was anything of interest closer. As he got closer to the pond, he said that he could smell something that could only be described as rot or decay. And then he heard that now familiar creaking noise we heard earlier, quieter and not too far off. Looking in the direction of the noise, he said he saw the tree moving, not like swaying, but shifting its bark down along base of it until it reached the forest floor and disengaged from the tree. What he saw was about 4 tall, thin, almost emaciated bipedal creature with long legs and a short torso with long arms that ended in claws. The skin of the creature looked eerily identical to tree bark almost all over. He stood in disbelief, staring at this thing as it turned toward the pond, showing a set of beady greenish eyes with a red tint and no sign of ears, almost lizard-like. He watched as this thing sauntered toward the pond's edge, knelt down and cupped water into its hands and brought it up to its mouth, exposing a wide mouth full of small, pointed teeth, and drank the water, kind of like a person would do. Seeing this had startled Mike a bit, but as he began to step backward slowly, he gasped and dropped the branches, drawing attention to himself with the creature staring right at him. Mike turned and fled back to me where he told me this story. Of course, I looked at Mike with disbelief and tried to calm him down, telling him after the trip and getting lost out here and the eerie feeling we had earlier, his eyes must have been playing tricks on him. Once he had finally chilled out and everything seemed to calm down, we had a quick dinner and retreated to our tent to get some sleep. We sat talking for a bit. I could tell he was fighting falling asleep as he was still terrified that whatever he saw was real and was after him. So I told him I would wait up for a few hours just to make sure we were safe and kind of keep watch. With this, Mike finally drifted off, leaving me to my book and the sounds of insects, owls, and other creatures of the night. A few hours had passed, and by then I was growing tired myself. Setting my book aside and residing to my sleeping bag, I was ready to drift off when I thought I heard some rustling outside out the tent nearby. Thinking nothing of it but a curious raccoon or various wildlife coming to see what the delicious smell of hot dogs was, I laid my head back down to try to fall asleep. But I noticed the scent of cooking, and the fire itself had now been replaced with putrid death. It was soul foul. I had to hold back from losing my dinner right then. That's when I heard it and sat up bolt right. The trees above us were rubbing together. The sound was almost deafening, however. Listening intently, I realized quickly that the wind was still, no leaves were rustling, and the night outside was silent, aside from the creech that sounded as though it was all around us. That's when I noticed it. The noise was not coming from just above us. It was coming from all around us, in different pitches, different tones, some with more bass. There were at least a dozen different voices. These things were all around us. Not trying to make any sudden moves, I slid my hand into the bag next to my sleeping bag and found the handle to my machete, slowing, pulling it out, and just holding it against me like it was the holy grenade or something. I began to frantically look around the tent to see if there was anything else I could use as a shield, or something, when I noticed Mike sitting up in his sleeping bag, paralyzed with fear. I scooted closer to him and whispered that he needed to grab his knife and sit back to back against me to cover all angles. So we did, and we sat there like this until the sun began to rise. We stayed awake until the morning, both from absolute terror and adrenaline, staring all around us in what can only be described as fear-forced vigilance. While nothing ever attacked us through the night, there were several times one of these things brushed against our tent, the embers from the near-dead fire illuminating just enough to see outlines of whatever it was. The creaking noises were heard all night long, things being banged around in our campsite, items moved around and torn through. but nothing got inside our tent. It wasn't until the sun was fully up and birds were chirping for a few hours before we decided to leave the confines of our nylon fabric fortress. I poked my head out first, half expecting to be met with giant claws to my face, but nothing. We both exited the tent, and our sight was a complete disaster. I've had coyotes and bears and raccoons tear through my campsites before, but nothing like this. The cast iron skillet that was to the side of the fire looked like it had been put through some kind of metal shredder. Pieces of it hung off jaggedly while it looked like something just chewed right through it. The rocks around our makeshift fireplace were all but scattered. The undergrowth around our site was trampled and lain flat. The cords holding onto the tent stakes were torn and frayed. But the scariest part, all of the trees surrounding us, they were all now missing the bark from base to the top of tree. We gathered our belongings and trash as quick as we could, breaking camp and hightailing it back to my truck. Just as I was about to shut my door, something caught my eye. On the hood of my truck, there in the dust stirred from the roads, were small clawed footprints about 5 inches long. I rustled for my phone in my pocket to take a photo when I heard it behind me, freezing me in place. A low, not too distant creech from up above us. Quickly risking a glance as I shut my doors, I saw it for the first time, near the top of one of the nearby trees, one of these creatures, and I managed to snap a quick picture before speeding off as quickly as I could. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more of my content, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Let us know down below in the comments which story was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching.